Thank you, Ben. As Ben said, this session is entitled Socialists and the EU Free Movement Debate, and it follows on the previous session in this series on Britain after Brexit, where I think a number of comments I recognise from the room were in the previous discussion on were socialists right to say no to the EU. But this session is to deal with a bit more with the question precise, of the issue of the free movement questions which come up in the EU debate. Now I'm going to start it slightly unusually, as Ben did get my surname right, Heemskerk, which gives an indication of my Dutch origins. My dad actually, he was 88, died last month. As we're going through his papers, we found his certificate of registration when he first moved to Britain in 1951, issued under the Aliens Act at that point, which is the way it was posed. It had to, it lists all the restrictions. It had to report to the police within 72 hours if he changed his address, and he did change his address a few times from lodging with Mrs. Hutton, to Mrs. Winterton later on, and stuff like that. So he had to say go to the police within 72 hours if he wanted to change his address or change his place of work, until the final entry in the card in 1956 when it said married Miss Jean Harper in Shrewsbury Ness, and then he didn't have to. He was then able to no longer be subject to the restrictions of the Aliens Act at that time. Now that's an example of, if you like, capitalist controls on the movement of labour. And we have to be absolutely clear that socialists do not support giving such power to the employers backed up by their state, and there's no question, like the Orgreave issue has revealed once again, who does control the state. We are not in favour of giving such powers to the employers and their states over workers. That's a fundamental starting point in this discussion. Now, but that obviously then, that's a general principle. How does that apply to the different issues that we face? Now, my dad, Ari, was a low-paid agricultural worker when he came to Britain. He actually got a work visa because, and this won't be a surprise, he was a skilled tulip grower, as most people, agricultural workers in Holland are. And there was a shortage of people who knew how to force bulbs in the winter. I turned one bulb into two, basically. So that's how he got his work permit and his residency in 1951. But the truth is, that was agriculture has always been a low-paid sector. There was no real protection against the employers, except for the fact that he came to Britain in 1951 after the war, during the long post-war boom, when actually the balance of class forces, including the existence of Labour as a capitalist workers' party able to put pressure on the ruling class, did create opportunities for the working class to force greater concessions from the capitalists. And there was even elements, even to the point in the 50s, 60s and 70s and into the 80s, even elements of workers' control, such as, for example, the question of a closed shop in union organised workplaces, where you couldn't be a member of the workplace unless you were a member of the union. My brother, for example, went to work in Dagenham in the late 70s, early 80s, and he had to join Amicus, as it was, or actually the engineering unions, AEU, Amalgamated Union of Engineers, before it became Amicus, then merged into Unite. But he had to join the union before he could get a job. It was a closed shop in that workplace. Now that wasn't the case, of course, in agriculture. So I must admit, it's disappointing. I mean, my dad wasn't a socialist; he was just an agricultural worker, really. But didn't take a political stance. But it's disappointing that all we have is his aliens pass. It'd be very good if he had a trade union card where the employer had to sign that his wages weren't undercutting other workers, where the employer had to accept collective bargaining, trade union rights to guarantee health and safety, proper training, and perhaps actually, in the ideal world, where the employer had to report to the trade union organiser within 72 hours if they wanted to try and change terms and conditions or move their capital around, and there was no exemptions even when the employer got married. That would be a real shift in the balance of power to the working class. And by the way, of course, that option of marriage is no longer exists for non-EU migrants into Britain unless you earn over £20,000. A threshold has been introduced. So actually, so therefore, it wouldn't have applied to my dad then in that sense, because he married my mum who works in the shoe shop, so they wouldn't have reached the earnings threshold to have got married at that point, to have got in residency at that point. And it's that contrast really between capitalist control of labour and workers' control of labour, and capitalist control and workers' control. That is that contrast that we need to try and bring in to shape the whole debate, the whole approach that socialists have to Brexit in its entirety, but also to the free movement of labour debates within that question of what now after Brexit. And as the previous session in this course discussed, the Socialist Party opposed the EU because at bottom it is a treaty, a series of agreements between the capitalist classes of 28 nation states aiming to create the greatest possible opportunities for the European multinationals to exploit the working classes of Europe. And we stand for a socialist exit from those from that treaty, from those series of treaties. But obviously that doesn't mean everything. The EU treaties actually comprise 80,000 pages of agreements, including 13,000 regulations. And I haven't been all through them, so I cannot say which ones we would particularly. I mean, the vast majority, I'm sure, on standardised light bulbs and so on. And actually, bluntly, I don't care about the bananas and their shapes. Really, ultimately, they're not critical. It's not critical for the future of humanity. But the vast majority of those 80,000 pages of agreements, 13,000 regulations, would be totally unobjectionable. But we also have to say that others are very objectionable to socialists. And that includes, and they would provide serious legal obstacles to the implementation even of Jeremy Corbyn's limited programme. So we do stand for, I mean, Theresa May's raised this idea of a Great Repeal Act. We stand for a socialist Great Repeal Act of a completely different character to Theresa May, which would abolish, for example, the EU's procurement laws, which force all public contracts of over £100,000 to be put out into a competitive tender and advertised actually on this thing called the European contracts page, which is a website and so on. And that includes, for example, councils. When we had socialist councillors like the comrades in Lewisham or in Southampton, all proposals being put before a council get ticked off by the legal department. Do they comply with EU legislation, these EU regulations, state aid rules, and so on? So we would abolish, we would have a Great Repeal Act which would abolish those type of restrictions, abolish the state aid rules which disallow legally, I mean obviously not in practice in terms of a movement, but disallow legally nationalisation of the steel industry, nationalisation of the banks and so on, the postal services regulations, the behind the privatisation of Royal Mail, the points we've made before on around nationalisation and so on. But that great repeal, to use that phrase, or socialist repeal, would also include those EU regulations and directives which are an impediment in the day-to-day struggles of workers, which are part and parcel of the EU single market. And that's the EU single market, which is shaped by the so-called four freedoms: the freedom of movements of goods, services, capital, and labour. And those directives, those acts, those laws, those treaties were actually pulled together and codified in 1986, or rather, the negotiations started. The treaty was signed in 1986 by Margaret Thatcher. Negotiations then continued, and the single market was completed in 1993. And it does include measures which we've discussed before. It was raised partially in the previous session of the Posted Workers Directive, which was at the core of the Lindsay dispute in 2009, because the Posted Workers Directive doesn't recognise collective agreements between workers and employers. They have no legal standing under EU law. And therefore, even though there was an agreement covering the construction industry called the National Agreement for Engineering and Construction Industry, which set pay rates, terms and conditions and so on, that couldn't be enforced under the EU Posted Workers Directives. And those workers who went on strike to defend their conditions were actually breaking EU law, could have been prosecuted under EU legislation and so on. And membership of the single market enshrines those. That's what the membership of the single market actually means. But it was more than that. It actually included further erosions of trade union and workers' rights, because it's not really well known, but it's an irony that in order to get ready for the single markets, as they signed by Thatcher in 1986, a series of negotiations, and implemented in 1993 under John Major, the Tories introduced legislation to abolish the closed shop, which I mentioned earlier on. In other words, the situation where trade unions achieved a degree of control over their workplace, so that only members of a trade union could be employed in a particular workplace. And the Tories brought forward legislation in 1990 Employment Act to abolish the closed shop. And there's an irony here for those on the left, like Paul Mason, the journalist, who says, I'll quote it here, it says, the only question the leaders of Britain's parties, and this includes obviously Jeremy Corbyn, have to answer is, will you strive to keep Britain inside the single market through this thing called the European Economic Area, which is the EU countries plus Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. In other words, he sees defence of the single market with the so-called four freedoms as absolutely critical, as the critical question, the only question, to use his phrase. But the irony of it is that that act, which was behind the abolition of the closed shop, was pushed through by the right wing in the Labour Party in the late 1980s, despite a parliamentary revolt by Jeremy Corbyn, Dave Nellis, Eric Heffer, Tony Benn and so on, who voted against the implementation of the Single European Act. It was pushed through by Labour's Shadow Employment Secretary, one Tony Blair. Which says a lot in terms of how the EU is part of neoliberalism. It's part of, in effect, creating the least possible impediments on the freedom of capital. That's the real one. That's the one they're really concerned about. The freedom of the hedge funds, of capital, and the ability to reverse the balance of power in the workplace against the working class. So, from that point of view, we have to say, it's clear from that example when it was the left in the Labour Party that tried to resist the implementation of the European Single Market Act in 86 to 93, but it's clear that the labour movement, the workers' movement, doesn't support the so-called free movement of goods, services, capital and labour as a point of principle. And that goes back actually to the founding days of the labour movement. There is a very interesting passage, for example, in Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1, when he describes a situation that developed in the 1860s in the cotton industry, in particular in the northwest around Manchester, where workers, new formed trade unions, embryonic trade unions actually in many cases, actually formed emigration societies in order to encourage what they saw as surplus labour to move to the US or to move overseas, in order to in order to stop the employers using surplus army, the reserve army of labour to drive down wages. So they formed emigration societies and asked for public support for public funding, and the employers of course opposed them. And there was actually a letter which Marx quotes in the Times from the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, where it's quite blunt: the master cannot see his labour supply removed, and therefore there should be no public funding for these emigration societies. But that puts it in clear class terms. It's a case. It's not a question of control or not. Under capitalism, labour power is controlled or organised by the hidden hand of the market, by in that sense the laws of supply and demand. That's what capitalism is. But the issue isn't whether it's control or not, it's the question of who controls and in whose interests. and how can we ensure the interests of all workers are defended to the best possible degree. Ultimately, of course, in a socialist society where you have democratic planning. But even within the context of capitalism, the workers' movement must fight for the greatest possible degree of control in defence of working class people. Now, that's why we don't support immigration caps and the call for immigration caps, which the Tories make. And actually, really, it's just a propaganda tool. The idea that the Tories have of we have a target of getting immigration less than 100,000. It's a net migration less than 100,000. It's absolutely meaningless in terms of practical terms, but it's a propaganda tool to try and divide on the working class. Just as one simple example, the fact is that 4 out of 10 people classed as immigrants into Britain each year are actually students. And as an aside, higher education is the 7th biggest export industry in Britain at this stage. So in terms of foreign currency earnings, and actually, if you ask people, they don't say that a student at local universities, they're not perceived as immigrant. That's not the Daily Express's narrative in that sense. So if you wanted to, you could you could cut immigration in inverted commas by 40% overnight, just by classifying students as students, not as not as immigrants. And we have to explain other myths patiently in this discussion. That that there are 4.7 million UK-born people living abroad, the 8th highest of any country in absolute numbers. That, for example, at the present time, there's 2 million UK nationals living in the EU. And they have access to EU health rights and so on. And in Spain, for example, over 50% of the Britons living in Spain are over 50. So they've gone to retire, bluntly, in Spain. And the cost of non-Spanish residents' healthcare cost to the Spanish state is over €1 billion. Whereas the 2 million plus migrants, EU migrants living in Britain are younger, use the NHS less, and so on. So we have to patiently explain these type of arguments to counter the myths, but we have to also recognise propaganda is not enough. In that sense, we have to take into account how the capitalist politicians use the arguments about migration and free movement and so on to try and build a social base. Because we have to remember, the capitalist politicians have to defend a system that is based on the exploitation of the vast majority in the interests of a tiny minority. And if they did that, if their party election broadcast was to say, if Trump had actually said, I stand for the billionaires and my aim is to squeeze as much as possible out of you, vote for me, he wouldn't have got 60 million votes in the US election. So they have to try and create a narrative, create arguments to maintain a social base, to try and divide the working class. And nationalism, with racism as its most virulent expression, is one of its most important weapons that it has. And of course, our saying that is one thing, but then how do you deal with that? Because we have to recognise that capitalism emerged from the nation states. Actually, the first capitalist country was Holland in the Low Countries, by the way, and then it came to Britain and so on. But let's leave that to one side for a minute. But it emerged with the nation states, and of course with slavery as well, which had to be justified by creating an ideology of white superiority and so on. And those ideas have deep roots, and they are cultivated. Look at the hysteria. I don't know if Jeremy Corbyn, if he's wearing a duffel coat at today's remembrance ceremony, but look at the hysteria that we whipped up when Jeremy Corbyn mumbled the words of the national anthem by these so-called progressive Remain politicians. They whipped up that hysteria. Let's be absolutely blunt about it. It's part of cultivating a social base in order to preserve the rule of capitalism. And let's be clear, those cultivators do include those capitalist politicians who supported Remain. It wasn't really mentioned in the previous discussion on the EU where part of this issue was touched on, but it was Theresa May as Home Secretary who organised the Home Office vans with the headline "Go Home," with the number appealing for so-called illegal migrants to phone up and get help to to go home, in inverted commas. That was Theresa May. There's not an ounce of progressiveness in the so-called Remain capitalist politicians. We have to be absolutely clear on that. But we also have to say that propaganda explaining those type of issues is not sufficient. It's not. It doesn't provide a sufficient answer to working class people and answering their concerns. But we also have to question and sort of try and break down what does it mean when people say they're worried about immigration. And really, I like using this phrase that I think the Inuit in the Arctic have, I think it's about 27 words to describe snow. And really, we have to say, immigration in Britain has 27 meanings or more, 50 meanings. It means I can't get a place on the housing list. It means, why is my GP surgery full up? It means, I can't get a job. It means low pay. It's a simple, it's a easily available answer to the problems which working class people face. And it was interesting. There's been a number of polls on this, but the most comprehensive one was in 2012. There's been later polls on this as well. But there was a comprehensive British social actually tracker poll survey in 2012, asking people what is the most important issue facing the country in general terms. And this was after the defeat of the pensions movement. The TUC demonstration was back against austerity in 2011 was back in the memory, and so on. So when you're faced with a simple, with that question posed in that way, 47% says immigration. But then they were asked, what's the most important issue that faces you and your family, that affects you and your family's conditions? And then it was the economy, pensions, health, tax, family life, education. Way down the list was immigration in terms of their personal experience, their personal factors. But of course, it was there as an answer, because it's been promoted by the capitalist class. In other words, when working class communities feel rightly that they have no control over their lives, they are subject to the forces of the hidden hand of the markets working its way through. Their jobs, they have no control. Their resources, their local services are overstretched. The most easily available explanation is immigration, in inverted commas, and there's no, and that can get an echo if there's no authoritative, alternative answer being put. And let's just take things like the housing shortage. It came up a bit in the debates this morning. The big 9 house building monopolies in Britain, they hold enough land with planning permission and the possibilities of starting building now. They hold enough land to build 600,000 homes now, or to start building 600,000 homes now. They have a cash pile of over £1 billion. They should be nationalised. They should be. Jeremy Corbyn should be raising the idea, not just in general of more public housing. He should be raising the question of public ownership of those companies and their land banks being handed to local councils to build council homes now. That could be done. And by the way, incidentally, Labour councils can borrow to build homes, and they should be doing that. And we should be raising that. They should use their prudential borrowing powers to start a house building programme in every Labour council. But that's how you turn round the Brexit debates. That's how you turn round these arguments about the lack of control. It's to raise the question of public ownership, which of course is against all the EU treaties, and to say that's what we mean by a socialist exit. That's what we mean by really taking back control. And the same would be true on jobs, to repeal the anti-union laws, to ban zero-hour contracts, to lift restrictions on secondary action or sympathy strikes. Employers try and get away with different companies and so on. Trade union control of employment agencies. That would stop the question of workers being undercut and by employment agencies only advertising jobs in Romania and so on. But all of that is against the free movement of labour provisions of the EU single market, and therefore we cannot give any support whatsoever to that in the debates that will come up over this issue on the EU. Now, to draw my remarks to a close, I think I'm running out of time. I used the words earlier on that when the working class faces impositions on their conditions, has a feeling of alienation, feels there's no way forward, that they have no control over their lives, their jobs, their communities and so on, that they look for an easily available alternative if there isn't an authoritative alternative narrative. And that's the point, and that was a bit of a feature of this morning's discussion. I was sitting there listening to some of the comrades and I thought, well, actually the point of the matter is that it's an objective fact, unfortunately, that the Brexit debates, the ruling class controlled the narrative of the Brexit debates. That's an objective fact, and that point, those words I'm using, authoritative alternative, is very important. It was an objective fact that the ruling class controlled the EU debates and will control the debate at the present time, unless, of course, an authoritative alternative emerges. And that's the tragedy of Jeremy Corbyn's refusal to stand by his position of opposition to the EU, because, again, it was mentioned by Sarah this morning, that the Electoral Commission had to choose which would be the official Leave campaign. And they chose the campaign led by Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Chris Grayling, Douglas Carswell and so on. They rejected the alternative campaign led by Farage and UKIP and Aaron Banks. But they also rejected the third application for the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition, which we put in. But we put that application in. And by the way, that incidentally in and of itself was a worthwhile exercise, because it shocked the right wing and the trade union movements that we had the audacity to say, well, why are you allowing these people to go unchallenged? Why shouldn't there be a socialist voice? But the truth of the matter is, if Jeremy Corbyn had led a Leave campaign, it would have been entirely a different matter for the Electoral Commission to have appointed Boris Johnson over the leader of the opposition. Let's be blunt about it. That would have been a completely different situation at that stage. And so instead of it being Dave versus Boris, imagine if it had been Dave versus Jeremy, or Cameron versus Corbyn in the EU debates. And Corbyn was putting forward this type of approach that we have for a socialist Brexit. And really, I suppose my concluding point is that we need an authoritative alternative, because otherwise the vacuum will be filled by the right, and that we cannot afford missed opportunities. We have to fight to make sure there aren't missed opportunities. We have to fight. I mentioned the 2011 March Against Austerity, which is always worthwhile going back to, when the TUC organised 750,000 people marching on the streets against austerity. 6 weeks later, UKIP organised a rally for cuts rather, a pro cuts rally. Cuts haven't come enough quickly enough. And Farage spoke at it. Priti Patel, no one had heard of at that stage, of course is now a cabinet minister, a leading Brexiteer and so on. She spoke at that rally. Matthew Elliott, who became director of Vote Leave, he spoke at that rally. They had 600 people. So you have 750,000 workers marching against austerity, 600 UKIPers rallying for cuts. But the TUC threw it away, as we know, because they didn't organise. They abandoned after the pension strikes. They abandoned the struggle. They threw it away industrially, and they threw it away politically by sticking with Ed Miliband's Labour Party at that stage. The EU referendum, Corbyn threw that. He made a mistake. Bernie Sanders, as we explained as a theme of this weekend, threw away the opportunity to undercut Trump. And really, the conclusion we need to draw from this is that the next period is going to see a debate over the character of Brexit, what type of programme, what would a socialist Brexit mean. We have to be clear, we do not stand in favour of the single markets. We are in favour of precisely giving powers to the working class to exert the greatest possible control they can over the workplace, over their working class communities, but also, of course, to follow that through with with the greatest possible control, which is socialism and the socialist planned economy. And we've got to take those arguments in and make sure that we can build the pressure that Corbyn doesn't miss this opportunity that's going to open up in the next period as well.